So, welcome to the Mindful Leader podcast. Today, I have a very special guest here with me, and it's Toby Pasman. And I got to know Toby a while ago while we were both working at the HPI coaching, basically training over quite some time. And it was a lot of fun and learning a lot of new stuff on how to really human potential coaching, how to really bring out the best version of yourself and basically in other people through that coaching process. And this is how I got to know Toby. And so when we talked a little bit already at that point, Toby was sharing that he was at that point already working on neurofeedback. And this was quite in the last year, so it was quite evolving. So Toby nowadays is the founder and CEO of NeuroFlex, a mobile peak performance brain assessment and training service in South Florida. So this sounds pretty cool. And I had in earlier podcasts, I was already talking about the importance of neurofeedback, what it can do for you, and what kind of potential can be unlocked. And so that's why I think it's very relevant. So as if you're listening now to this episode, if you're a tech leader or in general in a leadership position or a business professional where mental performance is critical, or you want to squeeze out more brain performance, I usually talk about the high performance mindset. And if you want to do this, neurofeedback is definitely something to consider. Now, Toby basically got into this field, and he was looking at that point at a variety of different disciplines, looking at psychology, neuroscience, nutrition, and physiology, and how to bring these things to the business world. So I think that when we talked about this, I felt this is a really good match in terms of for our podcast audience, because all of the many listeners are in tech, basically are in the business world. And I've seen usually big results or transformative results if you bring different disciplines together, and especially the cutting edge neuroscience research. And so this is where it looks like when we're talking with Toby, this is where we got really inspired and excited about these possibilities of this research, but also the practical applications. So with that said, Toby is also a board certified QEEG brain mapping. So QEEG brain mapping, what it is, we'll talk about later in the podcast. But this is, needless to say, this is some really cool stuff when it comes to visualizing the brain and actually looking a little bit more deeper what the brain is doing. And also, he's also certified in neurofeedback, PCN. He's also been trained extensively in using neurofield neurostimulation with Dr. Nicholas Dogris, along with training under neurofeedback pioneer Dr. Joel Lubar. So these guys are well respected in this field. So that means basically Toby, he really tried to, before going into this, really studying the field extensively, going in there. And that means we will have a pretty cool discussion today when we're talking about these topics. And with that said, I would say then welcome again, Toby. And first, thanks of all for being here today.
Of course, Rainer, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on your show.
Very good. Now, before we go into some of the areas around neurofeedback, maybe describe yourself a little bit, how you got there, where you are now, basically. Maybe start in earlier childhood or college, wherever you feel it's relevant, and share a little bit what got you here in this particular moment.
Sure. So I guess going back to childhood, I was always a very curious kid in terms of I was thinking about my own thinking, about other people, trying to understand why other people were thinking and behaving the way they did, trying to understand my own actions and behaviors. So I kind of always had this, sort of, I guess, interest in psychology and, even before I kind of knew what it was as a field. So in college, I took a biopsychology class, kind of learning about how the brain works on a biological basis. And I thought it was so fascinating to learn how all of our thoughts, feelings, emotions, everything we experience in the world, can kind of be linked back to the biological underpinnings of the brain. And the brain communicates on both a chemical and electrical level. The chemical side of things, people are a lot more familiar with. I'm sure a lot of your listeners have heard of dopamine and serotonin and adrenaline, all these kind of popular neurotransmitters. But what's kind of more neglected is the electrical side of things. So the brain it communicates with itself with these electrical frequencies, also known as brain waves. And I got really kind of passionate about learning about brain waves at my college research lab. I started working at a lab that was exploring how these electrical signals related to things like generosity, gratitude, and really trying to understand, what was going on in the brain during these states. So what I did in college was super fascinating. I really enjoyed it. But it was just measuring. It was just assessing what the brain was already doing. It wasn't changing the brain in any way. And that's what I really got, as I ended college, I was really left pondering the question of, now that we can assess and be able to see what the brain is doing electrically, can we also then change and improve the way the brain communicates with itself in order to improve things like depression and anxiety and help people suffering from neurological conditions. And that's really what drove me to the field of neurofeedback and brain mapping, because these are basically ways of assessing and then training the brain on an electrical level to actually modify the brain's electrical firing. And it all comes back to harnessing the brain's inherent neuroplasticity. So because the brain is plastic, it's able to rewire itself constantly. We know this, throughout adulthood, the brain does this. And this is something that's kind of, a relatively new discovery in the field of neuroscience. Up until a few decades ago, neuroscientists thought that the brain kind of, at the end of childhood and child brain development kind of stopped. And people thought that, kind of as you grew older, brain cells just started dying off, maybe from, excessive drinking or drug use or just the general aging process. And what we now know is that brain cells and connections sometimes do die off, but new ones are constantly being formed. And this is something that takes place, they've proven now, all the way throughout life, all the way up into if they make it to their 90s, this takes place still. So with that being said, I got really passionate about working with all of these neurotechnologies to really work on, changing and improving how the brain works, which then has such an impact on things like high performance, people's ability to have a growth mindset, for people to feel motivated, to be able to actually, follow through on the goals that they set out for themselves. A lot of it does tie back into how their brain is working on a biological level. And if people's brains aren't functioning properly, and people are dealing with excessive amounts of kind of brain fog and cognitive fuzziness, or they're trapped in anxieties and worries, it really detracts from people's ability to really perform at their highest level. So with what I'm doing now, it's kind of all about training the brain on a biological level to be able to then help people achieve whatever it is that, they're hoping to be able to do with their life.
Very good. Now, let's go back a little bit still in college. I'm curious about, in terms of then the motivation, you already mentioned in terms of, how the brain works, learning more about how it communicates and studying it. So I can see that those research aspects. Was there also personally a motivation when you learned about these capabilities for yourself that got actually where you said, oh, this is kind of cool? Where you then actually started with some self-experimentation as well to see is it really working, or is this right? How solid is it basically?
No, definitely so. Definitely so. And I would say that that experimentation started kind of taking place after college, but throughout college, and even earlier, I dealt with a lot of social anxiety, and I kind of, used to think of it as, early on as something that was just kind of innate, with who I was as a person, and thinking that I was going to always kind of have to deal with that throughout life. But as I started kind of learning more and more about how, you know, the chemical and electrical events that take place in the brain generate all of our feelings and thoughts and behaviors, I started realizing that, this is the social anxiety I was experiencing was the result of how my brain was performing. It wasn't something that was inherently tied to who I was as a person. And I really, really kind of learned this firsthand after college when I started in the neurofeedback field, actually playing around with neurostimulation. And I first started with a brain map on myself. So a brain map, as you had briefly mentioned in the intros, is basically a way to study the electrical activity of the brain. It basically transforms these raw EEG signals that we're able to pick up with these electrode caps, and it basically transforms that activity into these 2D heat maps of brain activity. So we're able to assess 5 major frequencies going from delta, theta, alpha, beta, and high beta. And we're able to see, is the brain producing healthy amounts of these different frequencies? Is it overproducing a frequency, or is it underproducing a frequency? And in what areas of the brain is that occurring in? So
sorry to interrupt, one quick thing. Do you happen to have a one of these caps around in that you can put take one into the camera that people get actually sense how that thing looks? Because I hope it makes it more concrete.
Yes, I certainly do. Let's see here. So
very cool.
I can actually put it on here. So this is what it looks like. It's a 19-channel cap, so it's measuring from all these different 19 electrodes.
And is it it's called a tri-cap, or
it's not a dry cap, so you do have to put electrode gel. I squirt kind of gel into each of these electrodes, kind of wiggle it around with a blunt tip needle, and then you plug it into an amplifier which connects to a computer and is able to sort of be able to read the electrical signal. So it kind of, well, the headphones are on here, but kind of basically sits like that. I won't pull it over my whole head, but
so that means, let's say a client comes to you and wants to get started taking a QEEG of the mind. So that means there is a little bit of preparation time. They have to put on that cap. Then you have to make sure these electrodes are connecting, and then using this lubricant basically to make sure that the connection is strong, right? So there's some calibration part. How long does it usually take to prepare a client to get into this?
Yeah, the preparation process is relatively quick. I would say, maybe a 10-minute setup, and then we'll do a couple 10-minute recordings, one with the eyes open, one with eyes closed. So, and then a little bit of cleanup time, but a client will come in and then, be out within like 45 minutes or so. So it's not an invasive procedure whatsoever, and it's not super time intensive.
And then going back to when you were doing experiments.
Yeah.
So you put them on, wired it, and then of course everything might be a little bit harder to do it for yourself.
Well, luckily I had a coworker who was able to hook me up, after work one day. We had all the equipment, so we would set each other up sometimes. And I basically, going back to kind of the social anxiety that I used to deal with a lot, I found that there were certain areas of my brain that were very involved in verbal fluency and social interaction that were basically running at, or I was overproducing some of the slower brainwave frequencies and underproducing some of the faster ones. So it's kind of those areas were offline a little bit. So I actually ran a neurostimulation protocol on myself based on the brain map, which is how I always, work with clients. It's all tailored based on what each unique brain map, what each unique person has going on with their brain. But I basically found for what my brain specifically needed was to kind of be sped up and be basically and train these beta brain waves, which are really involved in focus and concentration, and in certain areas of the brain will really help with verbal fluency and social interaction. And I would notice even from very early on, I think the first session or two, I would do this like after work. I would set myself up and I might call a friend or, a family member or something. I'd be on the phone, and I would notice that at first, when I first started the session, I'd be kind of, searching for words, and it was kind of like, my verbal fluency the conversation wasn't really running too smoothly, and I was hesitating a lot. And throughout the session, it was like I started realizing like I was just talking without even like thinking about what was going to come next, and not overthinking things in my head like I had always done in the past. And it was just like so much easier. And I realized how basically that effect lasted for a little while, kind of like during the session and after the session when I first started doing it. But the more sessions I did on myself, sort of like if you're teaching, say, a kid how to ride a bike, you use training wheels at first, and then, it sort of helps the kid be able to balance on the bike. And sort of the brain is similar in the sense of once you teach the brain how to produce these different electrical patterns, it gets better and better at producing them on its own. So I eventually got to the point where that level of increased verbal fluency and just way enhanced social interaction almost just became my new baseline state after I did enough sessions on myself. And that's what I've seen with countless clients and patients that I've worked with, whatever their issue might be, everything from mood issues to sleep problems, anxiety issues, you name it, there's basically the brain starts adjusting its electrical patterns. And then once you do enough sessions, it really starts becoming hardwired, and you can improve kind of raise the baseline of brain performance.
Very good. So then to summarize this, so we can basically say that there's the brain, there's pretty much everything is electrical activity. Then you mentioned there is the speed of these brain waves, right? Some of them are very slow, like the delta waves. Then there's the next one, theta, alpha, beta, high beta. So the higher basically they go, the faster the waves are. And so with the EEG, with the electrodes in that cap that you put it to, was it 19 different points, right? On the
Yes.
right? And
Yep.
then basically the signals, and of course they're probably very sensitive, these signals. They then go into a transceiver and then into the computer, and then there's some software. In the software then is where a lot of the magic happens to make sense out of all of these signals, right?
Exactly.
And then at the end of the day, there is a specific pattern that you see, that you actually seen it for yourself when you did it first time for yourself. You see a certain pattern, and the software at the end of the day, however, when you want to basically say that, oh yeah, this region or this area is doing a little bit more, this is doing a little bit less, that means there has to be some reference as well, right? A reference database.
Yes.
Can you share a little bit how that works, just so people get a sense of how the calculation is done?
Yes, that's a great question. So different brain map software systems, have different reference databases. But basically what they try to do is to take kind of, normal, and I say that in quotes because it's like what exactly is, a normal brain. Well, for, what they consider a normal brain, someone who's not on psychiatric medications, who doesn't have a psychiatric diagnosis, no history of like TBIs, traumatic brain injuries. So about as normal as you can get. And some databases have I believe around 1,000, 1,200 people. So they basically compile all of this data and then it's age matched. So they're able to say, a 10-year-old's brain, it's normal for there to be a lot more of the slower brain waves. Children spend a lot of time in these daydreamy states of alpha and theta, whereas those waves start decreasing as you get into adulthood. So the databases are always age matched. So we're able to know, kind of based on a patient's age or a client's age, what might be normal for them. But there is a limitation that because, normal might not necessarily be optimal. So that's something that probably a lot of, the clients or patients you work with, it's like not about just having, labs like blood labs that are in the normal range. We don't want to necessarily just be, normal performers. We want to be high performers. We want what's optimal. So that's something that basically for each person's brain is very, very unique. And we assess to basically see what the balance of the different brain waves. So not as it's not just comparing people's brainwave data to the reference database, but it's also comparing the brain to itself. And basically what I mean by that is, so the 5 frequencies, the delta, theta, alpha, beta, and high beta we're looking at, you can think of them as, think of the brain as a pizza pie. And basically we're trying to see how large is each slice. We know there's 5 slices, but those slices might not be even slices. So we're trying to measure to see, does someone have one huge slice and one really thin, small slice? So it's basically showing how much sort of neural real estate the brain is devoting to producing these different electrical frequencies. So to give you an example, so the theta to beta ratio is a very good indicator of ADHD, particularly in children. So if children have excessive, basically when I say excessive, usually at least 3 times as much theta brainwaves compared to beta brainwaves, that shows in research there's over a 90% chance that individual has ADHD. So there's basically this imbalance of, the theta brainwave taking up this huge slice of pizza, whereas the beta being this thin. Yeah, so it's about kind of balancing out those different brain waves. And when there's a balance of the brain waves, the brain can work in harmony and all of the brain waves can work in unison, because you want to be constantly being able to fluctuate. You want to be able to get into states of, increased alertness and be able to produce beta waves when you want to be able to focus and concentrate, but also when you want to be able to decompress and relax and maybe meditate or do yoga. You want to be able to sink into those slower brain waves, the alpha and theta, in order to get really deep restorative sleep. Your brain needs to be able to produce healthy amounts of delta brain waves. So it's not about taking people to get huge amounts of a certain brainwave. It's really about making sure that the brain is producing healthy levels, not too much, not too little, of all the different brain waves we're looking at.
Yeah. And I like the analogy with the pizza and the slices. I think people can relate to this. And especially now when I look at my audience, right, leaders in tech, business leaders, for them, many of them, they come to me, the topic of focus is usually, I would say, 6 or 7 out of 10. For them, this is a big issue, generating more focus. And yeah, of course, it could be even the case that some of them could be diagnosed with ADHD. But I see this usually more as a spectrum of basically there is basically the ability to focus is either there and it works very well, or it may work not that well. And I think here, this is the good thing with neurofeedback. You have a way to systematically measure this by looking at, okay, how much do we getting on this theta slice? So theta is the more slower wave. So how big is that theta slice? And now let's look at the beta slice. This is where people are actively thinking, and maybe that slice is way too thin. So that means the theta beta ratio, if it's more than, I think you mentioned 3, right? So if it's higher, it's usually a good indication that focusing is limited, right? And so this way, it's a very objective assessment. If you do this as a baseline, maybe not just once, but over multiple sessions, you can track it and you can also see how it changes over time, right?
And yeah, absolutely. And the thing I would add on to that is I don't pretend to be a mind reader. And what I mean by that is if I just look at a random brain map, I might be able to say, okay, these are patterns that are typically associated with, trouble focusing or, increased worry and rumination. But it's all about pairing the neurophysiology data with the brain map, along with doing a full intake, getting people's medical history, psychiatric history, looking at what things are working well in their lives and what isn't working so well in terms of, their relationships, their performance at work, their sleep, their ability, to kind of shift gears and calm down, after work. We look at all of these different things and pair it with the neurophysiological data to kind of give us a complete picture of, what someone might be dealing with. And it sort of helps almost give people some more understanding of, okay, I'm not just a weak person because I'm, not able to focus for however long I want, and I keep getting distracted in meetings at work. It's actually my brain is not producing sufficient quantities of a specific type of brainwave that enables me to focus for that, period of time. So it kind of takes a sort of like moral stigma out of the equation and helps people see, okay, what I'm dealing with is a brain issue, and those brain issues, because we're able to change the brain's functionality, all of those things can be altered and improved. We just need to give the brain the right stimulus to change. And that's why we need to do a brain map, so we're able to see which direction the brain needs to be pushed towards. And once we know that, we can start nudging the brain in different directions so it starts self-correcting and balancing out.
And let's actually now talk a little bit about this, right? So in this scenario, now we have, let's say, a person, and the person already had noticed, yeah, focus could be better. Sometimes I get too easily distracted. And now I heard about this neurofeedback stuff, and I was listening to this episode here where Toby was talking about focus. Say, cool, focus. So on one side, we do now what you mentioned, there's this assessment. We're doing this brain map using QEEG. We also look at the brainwave distribution. So we have now all this data. Great. And we may also realize, oh yeah, focus based on when we're looking at this, oh yeah, based on this, yeah, focus could be for sure, could be a topic here. But now let's actually go into now this phase when we now want to make some changes. So the idea of there is neurofeedback, right? So there is this feedback. We want to, at the end of the day, we want to alter this electrical activity in the brain. And the question is, how do we do it?
Great question. So there's a variety of different tools and technologies out there that can do this, and I work with a lot of them. And the reason being is, when you go to the gym, you don't just chest press for the whole hour that you're there. You might, if you're lifting weights, you might go to the chest press and then do some shoulder press and then lat pull downs and maybe hop on the treadmill for a little while. You kind of vary it up. And the brain is kind of similar in the sense of, when we're training the brain, technologies like neurofeedback, which we'll speak on, is very effective, but also some other kind of lesser known technologies like photobiomodulation, light therapy, really helps kind of repair the cell and stimulate the mitochondria, which produce all of the energy. And the brain is chock full. The neurons in the brain are chock full of mitochondria. So once you increase cellular energy with one of the devices we use is a photobiomodulation helmet, it actually enables the neurofeedback to work better because the brain has all of kind of the raw energy that it needs to then modify its electrical signaling. But then talking specifically about neurofeedback, because it is probably the most popular kind of neuromodulation, that's kind of the bucket that, or umbrella, that all of these different technologies fall under neuromodulation, and neurofeedback definitely being the most popular neuromodulation tool out there at this time. So basically what neurofeedback is basically you're hooked up to electrodes. It could be one electrode all the way, up to a full electrode cap. People do it a lot differently, but basically the basic premise is you're hooked up to electrodes, and in the computer, the neurofeedback trainer, in this case me, I would be basically plugging in what I want to reward the person's brain with doing. So let's take the case of the executive that's having trouble focusing, and we see on the brain map that they're not producing sufficient quantities of those beta brain waves, say in the frontal lobes. So if we see that kind of there's these locations where we'll put the electrodes kind of right on the frontal lobes and then reward the brain whenever it is producing more beta brain waves. And how that would look is, say you're watching with the neurofeedback, you'd be watching some kind of media, could be a TV show or movie, listening or watching something. And as your brain produces more of those beta brain waves, you would see the screen get clearer and the volume would get louder. Then when your brain, say you start wandering off, your mind starts wandering, then the brain is producing more of those slower alpha and theta waves, the reward will get taken away. So you'll see the screen kind of get all dark and the audio will drop down in the volume. So it's providing real-time feedback. This is millisecond by millisecond. So it's actually quicker than your conscious brain can process. So a lot of this is occurring subconsciously, but the brain is basically able to figure out what it needs to do in order to get the reward of the clear screen and louder tones. So it's basically the feedback part of basically telling the brain exactly when it's doing a good job, and then also telling the brain when it needs to self-correct. And that's basically neurofeedback in a nutshell. And it's something that the more sessions we do, the brain gets better and better at creating those different electrical patterns and starts being able to just produce them on its own without additional feedback.
So to summarize then, so let's say I'm now sitting back in a relaxed state. I wear this either this cap, or I have connected a few of these electrodes to the software, and the session starts. Then you define, okay, there is an objective today. We want to maybe learn how to generate more beta. Maybe we want to train how to lower theta, or maybe we want to train alpha to increase alpha waves. Whatever the objective is that you derived based on this analysis prior, and what are the objectives. So now you have determined this is the training goal. You sit back, and that you are in a relaxed state, and then at the end of the day, you may be watching to some video or to some light, or you may hear some sound as well, right? It could be, looks like then there is a variety of creative options there that can be used. And then you sit there for, I don't know, 30 minutes, 40
Usually
minutes.
30 minutes. Yeah.
So you basically chill, sit back, and the brain pretty much figures it out. You don't have to do anything. And then the session is over, and then that means training is completed. Now, if you do one session, that's great, but I know from my own experience, since I'm also doing, over the years, I did a lot of neurofeedback training. Usually you have to do multiple sessions. What's your experience in terms of seeing some of these results? What is a reasonable expectation?
Yeah. So in terms of, when you do your first neurofeedback session, the brain is starting to make the changes in electrical activity. It's starting to move in the right direction. But say the case of you're starting up a workout regimen and you haven't worked out in a year. It doesn't matter how hard you go at the gym, no matter how much weight you try to lift, no matter how much you exhaust yourself, you're not going to wake up the next morning looking like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. It's a process of, building muscle. So in the same way, the brain, it takes time to really harness its neuroplasticity. So you're not going to get necessarily a huge kind of overnight success. Now, people often will report from very early on, maybe the first session, noticing improvements in sleep or reductions in their stress levels. That can occur. But I think to temper people's expectations, usually once people do a few sessions, preferably, 5 to 10 sessions is what I really like to get in order to start seeing real significant changes, both in people's symptoms or what they're looking to achieve in terms of, say, focus, along with looking at the brain map. And that's actually my favorite part of what I do, is looking at the kind of pre and post brain map recordings and seeing, okay, this is how your brain looked functionally before we started doing any neurofeedback. And then we do, say, 10 neurofeedback sessions, and we see how the brain has actually changed its electrical firing, and it's producing much different activity, and is then resulting in, a change and improvement in people's performance. And it's something that the more, people ask, like, well, is there ever a point that I should just stop? How many sessions do I need to do? That's kind of the $1,000,000 question. And there's no solid answer to that. It's going back to the weight room analogy. It's like people don't think of training and lifting weights in that same way of like, oh, I've gone to the gym, enough times now. I don't need to ever go again. So I kind of think of the brain somewhat similarly, where, the more you do, the better. The more the worse shape that your brain is in to begin with, it's kind of the more neurofeedback is, we're going to need to do in order to get the brain back, to a decent level of performance. But you take your high performers, your CEOs, your executives, these people are already probably, their brains are already in a state of relatively high performance. They're just looking to get to that next level. So there's always a way we can like tweak and tune up the brain to just get to that even higher level state of productivity, focus, ability to manage stress. And the more sessions people do, the benefits will continue to accumulate.
So yeah, this is great. So, and the good thing, it's all measurable, so you can track progress over time. You can make corrections. This is great. It's a data-driven process, which I enjoy and I like. And maybe since we're running also out of time, I want to think one more thing is so from your clients, what you experience, and do you see like more people who are more focusing on, okay, there is all these problems, can't focus, ADHD, anxiety, these type of things, when there's a real problem there, compared to people like who want to squeeze out more performance? Is there like the balance between those, or is it more the people who come to you who are more in the problem space or more in the optimization phase, or is it mixed?
Yeah, so with my company, NeuroFlex, it's specifically peak performance and wellness oriented. So these technologies like neurofeedback have traditionally been used in a clinical setting, for the past few decades now, where people will have to go into psychiatrists or psychologists' offices. And in some cases, that still is kind of, the right move if people have severe kind of mental health cases, or they've had a recent traumatic brain injury. It's still a very good idea to do that. And that's why, since I'm not a licensed practitioner, I'll direct people, to do neurofeedback under the guidance of a practitioner if need be. But with the clientele I work with, it's strictly the peak performance people who are looking, it's the same type of people who are going to, they're doing yoga and going to cryotherapy. They're into biohacking, and they're really looking to maximize their brain or their overall performance, and they see these technologies as a way to really upgrade their brain and get to that next level.
Very good. So then maybe a last question. We could probably talk another hour and go deeper. Probably do follow up episode for sure. But
Definitely.
maybe a practical aspect here. So let's say people got excited, they're listening to this and say, oh yeah, cool, I want to also start doing this. I want to squeeze out a little bit more. I want to get more focused, or generate more alpha waves, go more in a balanced state, whatever the objective is. And they have heard now the cool stuff, what you're doing. Of course, we will put links to your website, to your blog, and so that people can get in touch with you for sure. But let's say listeners here in Europe, right? So you're located in Florida. If they say, oh yeah, this is great, I like what Toby is doing, I want to go there and give it a try. So is it reasonable to assume if they basically visit you from Europe and stay there for maybe a week or 2 weeks, and then they do like every day, like a batch of sessions, right? Like really optimizing it for a full week or maybe a little bit longer. Is it reasonable to assume some good results with this type of approach, or is it better to usually have more this regular thing that maybe you do it once or twice a week over, let's say, 2 or 3 months?
Yes. So there's definitely different approaches to neurofeedback. And in terms of, there are some programs that are these neurofeedback intensives where you might come to a place and sort of do a week of training where you're training 2-3 hours every day. That's kind of in the minority of the way neurofeedback practitioners usually approach things. A more standard approach would be working with a trainer maybe 2 times a week, 3 times a week if clients are really looking to maximize their results. If any of your listeners happen to be in the Fort Lauderdale, Miami area, not sure if they are, but if they do happen to be there, I'd be happy to work with them. If they're not, I would recommend that people, there's a resource, isnr.org. There's a find a provider tool, and I can send you the link to that so we can include it in the show notes. But basically, you can find a certified neurofeedback practitioner through that search tool. And what you want to look for is someone who's board certified in neurofeedback, who has a BCN. Preferably also they have a QEEGD, which is the certification in brain mapping. So looking for those couple credentials is really key when people are trying to find a neurofeedback practitioner, because just like you're not going to bring your car to just any random person to try to get it fixed. You want a mechanic that that's their career, that they've been studying this, they know what they're doing. It's same, if you're going to be altering the electrical activity of your brain, you want someone who's gotten the proper training and certification. And that's why I really urge people, if they're interested in now starting neurofeedback after maybe listening to this episode or one of the other episodes you recorded on neurofeedback, I would really urge them to try to find a practitioner who's board certified.
And if so, yeah, that makes sense. But let's say when they say they've seen this, that, oh yeah, Toby, I really want to work with you and get a glimpse of what's possible. Are you offering, let's say, a week or 2 week type of programs where they get a first impression and do some of the training to see how it works for them?
Yeah, definitely. For people who are coming in from out of the area, I do some intensives where we would, start someone the first day with a brain map, and then kind of run people through the different neurotechnologies, the photobiomodulation, the audiovisual entrainment, neurofeedback, do some heart rate variability training. All these technologies I'll kind of do and work with people, maybe every day, maybe even twice a day in some cases, if people do have a very limited time on their hands. So if anyone is planning a trip to the Florida area, South Florida, I'd be happy to work with you for a week.
Yeah, so I think it's not a bad thing. I mean, there could be worse places in the world than compared to going to Florida in the sun, right? So
Especially this time of the year. Yeah, it's perfect, 75, 80 degrees out. And yeah.
So it looks like then this could be a good option. Basically, you schedule maybe a week or 2 week vacation, but it's a productive vacation in the sense that it's all about training your brain, and then you do this a little bit, and the rest for the time you can chill, relax, enjoy the sun, and when you come back, didn't you just had vacation time, but you actually did a lot for your brain in terms of improving some of the frequencies or some of the objectives that you were looking at. So that's pretty cool.
Exactly.
Very good. So with that said, since we're over time already, definitely thanks a lot. So we'll put out some of the links that you mentioned in the show notes for sure. I think we want to do at some point also some follow-up to go a little bit deeper in QEEG and provide maybe also a few examples for people who really get into this. I know when I was looking at these maps, this is quite impressive when you start looking at your own brain, looking at it for the first time. And so I could see there are some good opportunities for deep dives. But any, maybe I would say in terms of last advice or something that you want to say to our listeners as an action item out of this episode, where you say this is something that you could do to get started in this area.
Yeah, absolutely. And Reiner, if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to just, my patient just knocked on the door. I'm going to just tell her that I'm going to be a minute and then I will answer that question. Right.
Very good.
Yeah. So in terms of an action item, I would say, not even directly neurofeedback related, but just in terms of something that people could do, to really maximize their brain performance. I would say, getting sufficient, deep sleep, which could be increased by, we know that aerobic exercise can increase deep sleep, limiting caffeine later in the day, avoiding stimulants, using blue light blocking glasses, or making sure you have something like Flux installed on your computer, or kind of a night mode on your phone, really making sure that you're not blocking your body's melatonin production. All of these things are going to help you get really good deep sleep. And deep sleep, I really truly believe, is sort of the underpinnings of all of the brain performance, and being able and enabling the brain to really get the rejuvenating, restorative time to really clear out toxins and cellular debris that accumulates throughout the day, and really just wake up in the morning with a ton of energy, ready to jump out of bed. So definitely, people, I would recommend that they really hone in on their sleep.
Thanks. Yeah, this is helpful for sure. Deep sleep, improving sleep, and thanks for sharing some of the sleep hacks and best practices. So thanks again, Toby. This was a great episode. I think hopefully the listeners here, they got a glimpse into what's doable with neurofeedback, QEG, brain mapping, and how to use it to optimize their brain performance. So thanks again for sharing all this knowledge. I hope we can do at some point follow up.
Absolutely. And one last thing I'll just mention, my website, neuroflex.com, that's NUROFLEX.com. It's a great resource just in terms of if people want to learn a lot more about brain mapping or neurofeedback. People can read a lot more about it on the site. Also, I'd love to talk to people. If I offer a complimentary 15-minute discovery call. So if people just want to hop on the phone and ask me whatever sort of question that they might have that popped up from our episode today, I'd recommend people just check out the website and book a call.
Very good. So we'll share neuroflex.com, and we'll put all of this in the notes, in the show notes, so that people have a chance to connect with you. And yeah, then thanks again for being here, and we'll talk hopefully in the future.
Thank you so much for having me on, Reiner. I had fun today.